Close your eyes for a second. When you think about the distant past, what do you see? Maybe you see golden masks, giant stone pyramids rising from the sand, and kings living like gods. We like to think of it as a magical time of mystery and romance. But if you could actually snap your fingers and travel back there right now, you wouldn't find a paradise. You would find a world that was dangerous, dirty, and incredibly hard to survive. Behind all that gold and glory, there was a darker reality that most people never talk about. So, get comfortable and let's take a walk through the real history that didn't make it into the fairy tales. Welcome, my friends, to a long journey into the sands of time. It is good to have you here with me. Tonight, we are not going to look at the history books that just give you dates and names. No, we are going to try to walk in the footsteps of the real people who lived thousands of years ago. We are going to look at the dust on their feet, the sweat on their brows, and the fear in their hearts. We often look back at the ancient world with rose-tinted glasses. We see the movies with the clean marble floors and the beautiful people wearing perfect white linen. But the truth is, life back then was a constant fight for survival. It was a fight against the sun, against the river, against disease, and sometimes, against the very kings who claimed to protect the people. You see, why life was brutal in ancient Egypt isn't just one simple answer. It is a collection of 1,000 little hardships that people faced every single day. From the moment a baby was born, the clock was ticking, and the odds were stacked against them. Let's start with the land itself. Imagine standing in the middle of a vast valley. To your left and to your right, as far as you can see, there is nothing but endless, scorching desert. It is a place of death, where the sun beats down so hard it feels like a physical weight on your shoulders. And right down the middle of this burning land cuts a single ribbon of water, the Nile River. Now, you have probably heard that the Nile was a blessing. And it was. Without it, there would be no life at all in that part of the world. It was the only source of water for drinking, for washing, and most importantly, for growing food. But living next to this massive river was like living next to a sleeping dragon. You never knew when it was going to wake up and destroy everything you loved. Every single year, the people waited with bated breath for the summer. This was when the snow melted far away in the distant mountains and the tropical rains fell on the south. All that water would rush down towards Egypt. If the water rose just the right amount, it was a miracle. It would cover the farm fields with fresh, black mud, a rich soil that allowed them to grow their wheat and barley. But the river was fickle. It had a mood of its own. Imagine you are a farmer in a small village made of mud bricks. You have a wife and 3 small children. You have been watching the river bank nervously for weeks. If the river doesn't rise enough, that's it. It's over. The water won't reach your fields. The ground will stay hard and dry like stone. You won't be able to plant any seeds. And if you can't plant, you can't harvest. And if you can't harvest, your family doesn't eat. It was that simple and that terrifying. Famines were common. There were times when the river was so low that people were reduced to eating grass, or worse. There are terrible stories from ancient texts that talk about people being so hungry they turned on each other. But let's say the opposite happens. Let's say the river rises too much. You are sleeping in your home, and suddenly you hear a roaring sound in the night. The water has burst over the banks. It's not just a gentle flood, it's a torrent. It smashes into your village. These mud houses weren't built to withstand crashing waves. They would dissolve and crumble. In a matter of hours, your home, your cattle, and maybe even your neighbors could be swept away into the dark, muddy water, never to be seen again. So, while the Nile was the giver of life, it was also a constant source of anxiety. You couldn't trust it. You had to pray to it, offer it gifts, and hope that the god of the flood, Hapi, would be kind to you this year. And it wasn't just the water itself that was dangerous. The river was home to monsters. Today, if we want to see a crocodile, we go to a zoo, and we see it sleeping behind thick glass. But back then, the Nile crocodile was a true nightmare. These beasts could grow up to 20 feet long. They were masters of camouflage. A woman could be walking down to the riverbank just to fill a clay jar with water for her family. The water looks calm. She steps in just ankle deep to dip the jar. She doesn't see the pair of eyes watching her from the reeds. In a split second, there is a splash, a scream, and she is gone, dragged under. It happened all the time. It was just a fact of life. Parents had to constantly watch their children. If a child wandered too close to the water to play, they might not come back. The crocodile doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care if you are a sinner or a saint, a rich noble or a poor peasant. To the crocodile, you are just meat. But believe it or not, the crocodile wasn't even the most dangerous animal in the river. That title belongs to the hippopotamus. Now, we think of hippos as these big, round, funny animals. But in ancient Egypt, they were feared more than almost anything else. A male hippo is incredibly aggressive and territorial. They weigh thousands of pounds and can run surprisingly fast. Imagine being a fisherman. You are out in a small boat made of papyrus reeds bound together. It's a fragile little thing. You are trying to catch some fish to sell at the market. Suddenly, the water beneath you heaves. A massive bull hippo slams into your boat because you drifted too close to his territory. The boat capsizes instantly. You are thrown into the water. The hippo has jaws that can snap a human body in half with a single bite. Many fishermen went out in the morning and never came home because of these river horses. In fact, one of the earliest kings of Egypt, a man named Menes, who was a legendary warrior, was said to have been killed by a hippo. If even a king wasn't safe, imagine how much danger a regular person was in. So, you have the river that might starve you or drown you, and you have the monsters living in it. But let's step out of the water and go onto the land. Was it safer there? Not really. The desert and the fields were crawling with things that could hurt you. Snakes were everywhere. The Egyptian cobra and the horned viper were silent killers. You could be walking through a field of tall grain, harvesting the wheat, and step on a sleeping viper. One bite, and without modern medicine, you were in serious trouble. Your leg would swell, the poison would spread, and you would likely die a painful death within hours or days. And then there were the scorpions. They loved to hide in the dark corners of houses. Imagine waking up in the morning, still half asleep, and putting your foot into your sandal, only to feel a sharp, burning sting. The venom of some of these desert scorpions was potent enough to kill a young child or an elderly person. It was a constant, low-level fear. You always had to be checking your shoes, shaking out your sleeping mats, and watching where you stepped. But big predators and poisonous creatures were only part of the problem. Sometimes, the smallest enemies were the worst ones. Let's talk about insects. In ancient Egypt, bugs were dormant. Flies were everywhere, clouds of them. If you look at ancient statues, you sometimes see people holding fly whisks, little fans to swat them away. They were relentless. They would land on your food, on your face, in your eyes, and they carried diseases, specifically eye infections. It was very common for people to go blind because of infections spread by flies. Then there were the lice and fleas. Hygiene was difficult when water had to be carried by hand from the river. Almost everyone, even the rich, had lice. This is actually one of the reasons why many Egyptians, including the priests and nobles, shaved their heads completely bald and wore wigs. It wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a way to keep the lice away. Imagine the constant itching, the discomfort of having bugs living in your clothes and your bedding. It was a miserable reality that made sleep difficult. And we cannot forget the locusts. This was a fear that lived in the heart of every farmer. You could work hard all year. You could plow the field, plant the seeds, water the ground, and watch your crops grow tall and green. You are days away from the harvest. You are calculating how much food you will have for the winter. And then, you see a dark cloud on the horizon. It's not rain, it's a buzzing, flying army of millions of locusts. They would descend on the fields like a plague. In a matter of hours, they could eat every single green thing in sight. They would strip the stalks bare. When they left, the field would look like a wasteland. Just like that, your entire year's work is gone, and starvation is staring you in the face. This environmental heat, the river, the animals, the insects, this was the stage upon which their lives were played. It was an unforgiving place. It demanded respect, and it punished weakness. Now, let's move away from nature for a moment and talk about the people themselves. How did they live? What was their society like? If you were born in ancient Egypt, your life was pretty much decided for you the moment you took your first breath. There was no American dream where you could start with nothing and become the leader of the country. It was a rigid pyramid, literally and figuratively. At the very top was the pharaoh. He wasn't just a king, he was considered a living god. He owned everything: the land, the animals, the water, and even the people. Everyone existed to serve him and the cosmic order he represented. Below him were the nobles, the priests, and the scribes, the people who could read and write. They lived in relative comfort, but for the vast majority of people, probably more than 90% of life was that of a peasant farmer. And let me tell you, it was a hard, grinding existence. You would live in a small house made of mud bricks dried in the sun. These houses were cramped. You might have a whole family of grandparents, parents, and children sleeping in one or two small rooms. The floor was just packed dirt. The roof was made of palm logs and thatch. It kept the sun out, but it also trapped the heat inside. In the summer, these houses were like ovens. You didn't have much furniture, maybe a few wooden stools, some reed mats to sleep on, and a wooden headrest instead of a soft pillow. Your clothes were simple linen. You probably had one or two outfits to your name. Your day would start before the sun came up. You would eat a breakfast of bread and maybe some onions or leeks. Then, it was off to the fields. Farming back then was back-breaking physical labor. There were no machines. Everything was done by muscle power. You used a wooden plow pulled by oxen to break the earth. If you were too poor to own an ox, you and your brother might have to pull the plow yourselves. You spent your days bent over, planting seeds, pulling weeds, and hauling water. The sun would beat down on your back until your skin was dark and leathery. Your hands would be calloused and cracked. Your feet would be tough as old leather from walking barefoot on the hot ground. And here is the kicker. You didn't even get to keep all the food you grew. Not even close. When the harvest time came, the tax collectors would arrive. These were scary men. They brought scribes with them who had recorded exactly how much land you had and how much grain you should have produced. You had to hand over a huge portion of your crop to the state. It was a tax to fill the pharaoh's granaries and to support the temples. If you had a bad year, maybe the locusts ate some of your crop, or maybe you were sick and couldn't work as hard. The tax collectors didn't care. They wanted their share. If you couldn't pay, things got ugly fast. The tax collectors carried heavy wooden staffs, and they weren't afraid to use them. Beatings were the standard punishment for not paying your taxes. Imagine the humiliation and the pain of being beaten in front of your family just because your field didn't grow enough wheat that year. It was a brutal system that kept the poor people poor and the rich people rich. But farming wasn't the only work people had to do. There was something called the copyright system. This was basically a labor tax. Since the farmers couldn't work in the fields during the flood season, because the fields were underwater, the pharaoh would say, "Okay, since you aren't farming, you can come work for me." This wasn't a request. You were drafted. Men would be rounded up from the villages and marched off to construction sites. This is how the great monuments were built. We often wonder who built the pyramids. Was it aliens? Was it magic? It was thousands and thousands of Egyptian farmers who were forced to leave their homes for months at a time. They would be taken to Giza or other sites and put to work hauling massive blocks of stone. We are talking about stones that weighed 2 or 3 tons. They didn't have pulleys or cranes. They had ropes, wooden sleds, and mud ramps. Picture yourself there. You are standing in a line with 20 other men. You are all holding a thick, scratchy rope made of palm fiber. An overseer is shouting at you, cracking a whip in the air to keep the rhythm. Pull, pull. You lean your entire body weight into the rope. The friction burns your hands. The muscles in your legs scream. You have to drag this massive stone block up a steep ramp under the blazing midday sun. If you slip, or if the rope snaps, that stone block could slide back and crush the man behind you. Injuries were horrific. We have found skeletons of these workers, and they tell a sad story. Their spines are twisted from carrying heavy loads. Their bones show signs of fractures that healed poorly. Many of them died right there on the construction site. And what did they get for this? Rations of bread and beer. That was it. They were building a stairway to heaven for their king, while they broke their own bodies down here on earth. This forced labor wasn't just for pyramids. The pharaohs were always building things: temples, obelisks, statues, new palaces. The appetite for construction was endless, and the fuel for this machine was the sweat and blood of the common people. One of the most famous builders was King Khufu, the man who built the Great Pyramid. History remembers him as a great king because of his monument, but in the ancient stories told by the Egyptians themselves, he was often remembered as a cruel tyrant. They said he closed the temples and forced everyone to work on his tomb. He didn't care about their suffering, he only cared about his own glory. Even his father, Sneferu, was a massive builder. He built 3 different pyramids. Imagine the amount of labor that required. Millions of man-hours, generations of men spending their lives dragging stones across the desert. So when you look at those pyramids, try not to just see the geometry and the size. Try to see the thousands of people who suffered to put them there. But life wasn't just hard because of work. It was hard because of the people around you. Ancient Egypt was a place where justice was swift and often very cruel. There were no prisons like we have today where people go for years to think about what they did. The Egyptians didn't want to waste food feeding criminals. They preferred physical punishments. If you were caught stealing, you might be beaten with a stick, 100 strokes. If you did something worse, the punishments became truly nightmarish. Let's talk about one of the biggest crimes you could commit: tomb robbing. The Egyptians were obsessed with the afterlife. They believed that when you died, you needed your body and your possessions to live forever. So, the kings and nobles were buried with gold, jewelry, furniture, and expensive oils. Now, imagine you are a poor peasant. Your children are hungry. You know that just a few miles away, inside a cliff, there is a dead king buried with more gold than you could earn in 1,000 lifetimes. The temptation was overwhelming. So, despite the curses written on the walls, and despite the guards, people did rob tombs. It was actually a huge problem, but if you got caught, God help you. There is a famous story from a much later time, around the time of Ramesses IX. They caught a gang of tomb robbers. These men had broken into the resting places of the ancestors. The authorities wanted to make an example of them. They didn't just execute them, they tortured them first. They wanted to know who else was involved. They beat them until their feet were useless. They twisted their limbs. And the final punishment, impalement. This is gruesome, so brace yourself. They would take a sharpened wooden stake and, well, let's just say they would stand it up in the ground and place the criminal on top of it. Gravity would do the rest. It was a slow, agonizing way to die, often taking hours or even days. And they would do this in public, so everyone could see. Why so brutal? Because robbing a tomb wasn't just theft, it was a murder. You were killing the person's soul by destroying their body and stealing the things they needed for eternity. You were attacking the gods themselves, so the punishment had to be terrifying. This brings us to another dark aspect of their life: the fear of the supernatural. The Egyptians were very religious, but their religion wasn't always comforting. They lived in a world full of demons and angry spirits. They believed that if you got sick, it wasn't because of a virus or bacteria. They didn't know what those were. They believed it was because a ghost was angry with you, or a demon had possessed you, or a god was punishing you. Imagine your child falls ill with a fever. You are terrified. You don't call a doctor who gives you medicine. You call a priest or a magician. He might come and chant spells over the child. He might give the child a nasty-tasting potion made of strange ingredients like donkey dung or crushed beetle shells, believing it would drive the demon out. The mental stress of thinking that invisible forces were constantly trying to hurt you must have been exhausting. You had to wear amulets, a little charms around your neck to protect yourself. You had to say the right prayers at the right time. If you had a bad dream, it was a bad omen. If a black dog crossed your path, it meant something. It was a life lived in constant superstition. And speaking of sickness, let's dive into the reality of health in ancient Egypt. Why life was brutal in ancient Egypt becomes very clear when you look at their medical records. They actually had some very famous doctors. They were known throughout the ancient world for being the best. But the best in 2000 BC is very different from the best today. We have found an ancient scroll called the Edwin Smith Papyrus. It's basically a textbook for trauma surgeons from ancient Egypt. It describes 48 different cases of injuries. It's fascinating, but it's also horrific. It describes men with crushed skulls, broken spines, and gaping wounds. These were likely injuries from construction accidents or from war. The treatments were primitive. For a gaping wound, they might stitch it up with a needle and thread, which is good, but then they might apply a mixture of honey and grease. Now, honey is actually an antiseptic, so that wasn't a bad idea. But they also used raw meat. Putting a piece of raw steak on an open wound is a great way to introduce even more bacteria. But the scariest thing about ancient Egyptian medicine wasn't what they put on the wound, it was what they did when they had to operate. Remember, there was no anesthesia. There were no painkillers like we have today, no shots to numb the area. If you needed a surgery, maybe to cut out a tumor or to set a bone that was sticking out through the skin, you were wide awake for it. The doctor might give you a jug of strong beer or wine and tell you to drink it fast. That was it. Then, 4 big men would hold you down. They would hold your arms and your legs so you couldn't thrash around. And then, the doctor would pick up his knife. These knives were made of copper or bronze, or sometimes even sharp volcanic glass called obsidian. They were sharp, but they weren't like modern laser scalpels. Imagine lying there, feeling the metal cut into your skin, hearing the sound of the doctor working, and feeling every single second of it. The shock alone killed many people, and if you survived the pain, you had to hope that the wound didn't get infected later. Let's talk about something very specific that made life miserable for almost everyone in Egypt, from the poorest farmer to the pharaoh himself: their teeth. You might think, oh, they didn't have candy or soda, so their teeth must have been perfect. Wrong. Their teeth were terrible, and for a very strange reason. It was the sand. Egypt is a desert. Sand is everywhere. It blows in the wind. It gets into your clothes, your hair, and your food. When they ground their wheat to make flour for bread, they used big stones. As they ground the wheat, tiny pieces of the stone would chip off, and sand from the air would mix in with the flour. So, every time you ate a piece of bread, which was the main food they ate every day, you were basically chewing on sandpaper. Over the years, this gritty bread would grind your teeth down. We have found mummies of young people, in their 20s, whose teeth are worn down almost to the gums. This exposed the nerves. It caused massive cavities and abscesses. An abscess is a pocket of infection in the jaw. Today, you go to the dentist, get a root canal, and you are fine. Back then, the infection would spread. It could go into your bloodstream or even into your brain. We have examined the mummy of King Amenhotep III. He was a rich and powerful king, but when he died, his mouth was a disaster zone. He had abscesses and worn down teeth. He must have spent the last years of his life in constant, throbbing agony. No amount of gold could stop a toothache, and the only cure the doctors had was to pull the tooth out again, with no painkillers. So, you have bad teeth, dangerous surgeries, and wild animals. But what if the pharaoh called your name for something else? What if he called you for war? War in ancient Egypt wasn't like the movies where everyone looks heroic. It was a chaotic, bloody mess. Let's look at the story of Thutmose III. He is often called the Napoleon of Egypt because he was such a great general. He ruled around 1450 BC. He wanted to expand the empire. He wanted more land and more power. But to do that, he needed men. He needed soldiers. If you were a young man in a village, you might be conscripted into the army. You would be given a simple shield made of wood and leather, and maybe a spear or an axe. You wouldn't have fancy armor. You would often fight barefoot or in simple sandals. Then, you had to march. The Egyptian army didn't just teleport to the battlefield. They walked. They marched hundreds of miles across the Sinai Desert to get to places like Canaan, modern-day Israel and Syria. Imagine walking for weeks in the desert heat, carrying your weapon and your water. If you fell behind, you were left behind. Water was scarce. Heat stroke took many soldiers before they ever saw an enemy. When you finally got to the battle, like the famous Battle of Megiddo, it was terrifying. The Egyptian strategy often involved unleashing a storm of arrows and then charging in for hand-to-hand combat. It was brutal, close-quarters fighting. You were hacking at the enemy with bronze axes, trying to smash through their shields. They were trying to stab you with spears. It was loud, dusty, and smelled of blood and sweat. And if you won, the horror didn't stop. After the battle, the scribes had to count the dead to see how great the victory was. But they didn't want to count whole bodies because that took too long. So, the generals gave an order. Every soldier had to cut off the right hand of every enemy he killed. You read that correctly. They would walk through the battlefield, find the dead bodies, and chop off the hands. Then, they would throw these hands into a big pile in front of the pharaoh. The scribes would then count the hands. There are pictures carved onto temple walls that show these piles of hands. It was a gruesome way to keep score. It was also a way to get paid. You might get a reward based on how many hands you brought back. This turned war into a literal butcher shop. And let's not forget what happened to the people who lost. If the Egyptians conquered a city, the men might be killed, but the women and children were often taken as slaves. They were tied together by ropes around their necks and marched all the way back to Egypt to work in the fields or the temples forever. So, war was glorious for the pharaoh who got his name carved on a wall, but for the soldier on the ground, and the people who were conquered, it was a nightmare of blood and slavery. Now, I want to shift gears and talk about a group of people we haven't mentioned much yet. What about the women? What they didn't tell you about ancient Egypt is that while women had more rights there than in other ancient places like Greece or Rome, their lives were still incredibly dangerous. A woman in ancient Egypt could own land, she could run a business, she could even take someone to court. That is impressive for 3,000 years ago, but biology was a cruel master. The most dangerous thing a woman could do was get pregnant. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women. They didn't have hospitals. They didn't have C-sections. When a woman went into labor, she would usually squat on two special bricks called birthing bricks. She would call upon the gods, specifically Torit, the hippo goddess of childbirth, and Bees, the dwarf god who protected households. But if the baby was in the wrong position, or if the mother started bleeding too much, there was nothing anyone could do. The midwives would try their best with massages and oils, but thousands upon thousands of women died in that room, bleeding out while trying to bring new life into the world. And because so many babies died, remember, 1 in 3 didn't make it to their first birthday. Women had to get pregnant many times to ensure the family survived. A woman might spend her entire adult life either pregnant or nursing. It was physically exhausting. Her body would be depleted of calcium and nutrients. There is a tragic discovery from a workers' village that really paints a picture of this. Archaeologists found a grave with a woman in it, but she wasn't alone. Between her legs, they found the tiny bones of a baby. She had died during childbirth, and the baby had died with her, half-born. It is a heartbreaking reminder that for all the gold and magic, they were helpless against nature. And if a woman couldn't have children, that was a social disaster. A man could divorce his wife if she was barren. She could be cast out. Her value was often tied directly to her womb. So, there was immense pressure on her. She would buy special fertility dolls, wear amulets, and pray constantly, terrified that her husband might replace her with someone younger if she didn't give him a son. Let's talk about those children for a minute. If you were lucky enough to survive being born, your childhood wasn't exactly playtime. If you were a peasant boy, as soon as you could walk steady, you were working. You were out in the fields scaring away birds from the crops. You were herding the goats. You were carrying water. If you were a girl, you were learning how to grind grain or remember the heavy stones, and bake bread, and weave linen. And there were dangers everywhere for kids. We talked about the crocodiles, but diseases were the silent killers. There was a parasite called the guinea worm. This is truly disgusting, so brace yourself. You got it by drinking bad water. The worm would grow inside your body, sometimes up to 3 feet long. Then, it would try to get out. It would usually burn a hole through the skin on your leg. The only way to get it out was to wait for the head to poke out, catch it on a little stick, and slowly, day by day, wind it out. If you pulled too fast and the worm broke, it would die inside you and cause a massive, fatal infection. Can you imagine being a 6-year-old child with a 3-foot worm crawling out of your leg? That was life on the Nile. Another parasite was the cystosome worm. It lived in the snails in the river. When people walked in the water to farm more fish, these tiny worms burrowed into their skin. They traveled to the organs and laid eggs. It caused calcification of the bladder and kidneys. It made people pee blood. It left them feeling weak and exhausted their whole lives. Archaeologists have found that huge percentages of the population had this disease. It was like a national plague that just drained the energy out of everyone. So when you see those statues of strong, muscular men, remember that in reality, many of them were likely anemia-ridden, sick, and in constant pain from parasites eating them from the inside out. But let's say you were unlucky enough to fall to the very bottom of society. Let's say you were a criminal, or a prisoner of war. The pharaoh might send you to the mines. This was, without a doubt, the worst fate a human being could suffer in the ancient world. The Egyptians loved gold. They called it the flesh of the gods. To them, it was a sacred metal that never tarnished, just like the sun. But gold isn't found in the nice, cool river valley. It is found deep in the eastern desert and down south in Nubia. These places are hell on earth. The temperatures can reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit or more. There is no water. There is no shade. The pharaohs would send expeditions to these mines. They would send thousands of men, and they knew that many of them wouldn't come back. There is a historical text that describes the gold mines. It says the miners worked naked in the dark tunnels, with candles strapped to their foreheads. The tunnels were narrow and hot, with barely enough air to breathe. They had to chip away at the hard quartz rock with stone hammers. The dust was thick. They breathed it in every day. It turned their lungs to stony, a disease we call silicosis today. They would cough up blood and slowly suffocate, and if they stopped working, the guards were there with whips. The text says the guards showed no mercy. They didn't care if you were old, or sick, or a woman, or a child. If you could hold a hammer, you worked. Water was rationed, a few sips a day. People died of thirst right next to the gold they were digging. And the worst part? There was no escape. You were in the middle of a vast desert. If you ran away, you would die of dehydration within a day. You were trapped in a burning oven, digging for shiny metal to make a mask for a king you would never see. Some ancient writers said that the people in the mines wished for death. They envied the dead, because at least the dead didn't have to swing the hammer anymore. This hunger for gold and monuments drove the entire civilization. It consumed people. Now, you might be thinking, surely the rich people, the nobles, had it good? Well, yes and number. They had food, they had nice clothes, they had servants to fan them, but they were also trapped in a dangerous game of politics. In the royal harem, the place where the king's wives and children lived, it wasn't just a big happy family. It was a snake pit. The pharaoh would have many wives, and each wife wanted her son to be the next king. This led to jealousies, plots, and murders. There is a famous legal document called the Harem Conspiracy Papyrus. It tells the true story of a plot to kill Pharaoh Ramesses III. One of his minor wives, a woman named Tai, wanted her son to be king, but Ramesses had already chosen a different son. So, Tai got together with some high-ranking officials, some army captains, and even the guys who guarded the pantry. They planned to assassinate the pharaoh during a festival. They used magic spells, wax dolls, and poison, and they also used daggers. It seems they actually succeeded in hurting him. Modern court scans of Ramesses III's mummy show a deep slit in his throat. Someone snuck up behind him and slit his throat down to the bone. They also chopped off his big toe, but the plot failed in the end. The son didn't become king. The rightful heir took over, and he rounded up the conspirators. The trial was huge. The punishments were, as you can guess, creative and terrible. Many were forced to commit suicide. They were told to take poison in the courtroom. Others had their noses and ears cut off. So even inside the palace, surrounded by guards and luxury, you weren't safe. Your own wife might cut your throat to get her son on the throne. And what about the magic I mentioned? The Egyptians were terrified of the evil eye. They believed that people could curse you just by looking at you with jealousy. This fear ruled their lives. If a baby died, it was because a neighbor looked at it with envy. If your cow died, it was a curse. This brings us to a very strange aspect of their culture, their obsession with death. We all know about the mummies, but have you ever stopped to think about why they did it? It wasn't because they loved death. It was because they loved life so much that they couldn't bear the thought of it ending. They wanted to take it all with them. But the process of mummification itself was gruesome. It was a business. When someone died, the family would take the body to the house of purification. It was basically a butcher shop for humans. The smell must have been unbearable. The embalmers were professionals. They would take a long metal hook and shove it up the dead person's nose. They would smash the thin bone at the top of the nasal cavity and then scramble the brain. Then, they would turn the body over and let the brain drain out through the nose like a runny soup. They threw the brain away. They thought it was useless. They thought you did your thinking with your heart. Then, they would take an obsidian knife and slice open the left side of the stomach. They would reach in and pull out the lungs, the liver, the stomach, and the intestines. These were washed and packed in salt. Imagine being the guy whose job it is to do that, day in and day out, in the Egyptian heat, with flies buzzing everywhere. Then they covered the body in a special salt called natron. It dried the body out completely. After 40 days, the body was like a piece of beef jerky, stiff and dry. Then they wrapped it. This whole process took 70 days. For 70 days, the family was mourning. But here is the sad part. This was expensive, really expensive. A full mummification with all the spells and the coffin cost a fortune. What if you were poor? What if you were that farmer we talked about? You couldn't afford the gold mask or the fancy tomb. For the poor, burial was simple. They would dig a hole in the sand at the edge of the desert. They would wrap the body in a rough reed mat and put it in the hole. Ironically, the hot sand often preserved their bodies better than the fancy chemicals used on the kings. We have found natural mummies of poor people that still have hair and skin, just dried out by the sun. But the poor still feared the afterlife. They believed that to get into paradise, the field of reeds, you had to pass a test. Your heart would be weighed against a feather. If your heart was heavy with sin, a monster called it part lion, part hippo, part crocodile would eat your soul, and you would cease to exist. We have talked about the monsters in the river and the pain of the whip, but there was a monster that was even scarier because you couldn't fight it, you couldn't run from it, and it didn't just kill one person, it killed entire families, entire villages, and sometimes, it nearly killed the whole civilization. That monster was famine. You see, Egypt was a bubble. It was surrounded by deadly desert. If the food ran out inside the bubble, there was nowhere to go. You couldn't just move to the next town, because they were starving too. There is a terrifying period in Egyptian history that historians call the First Intermediate Period. It sounds boring, but the reality was like a post-apocalyptic movie. The central government collapsed, the pharaoh lost control, and at the same time, the Nile stopped flooding. For years, the water stayed low, the fields turned to dust. We have writings from people who lived through this time, and they are the stuff of nightmares. One man wrote, "The land turns round as does a potter's wheel." He meant that the whole social order was flipped upside down. The rich were begging for food, the poor were looting the palaces. But it gets darker. Another text describes the hunger being so bad that people started eating grass. Then, they started eating their leather sandals. And finally, in the darkest whispers of history, there are accounts of cannibalism. One text says, "A man looks upon his son as an enemy." Why? Because he was so hungry. He saw his own child as competition for food, or worse, as a source of food. It says, "The children are dashed against the walls." Imagine living in a world where the laws of humanity have completely broken down. You are locking your door at night, not because of thieves who want your gold, but because of neighbors who want your flesh. It was a time of total chaos. This brings us to a concept the Egyptians were obsessed with. Mat was the idea of order, truth, and balance. It was the way the world was supposed to be. The sun rises, the river floods, the king rules, and the people are fed. When Mat was present, life was good, but the opposite of Mat was Fat, chaos, evil, disorder. The Egyptians believed that the desert was pure Fat. It was a place of chaos, and they lived in constant terror that Fat would take over their valley. When the famine hit, they believed that the gods had abandoned them, that chaos had won. This fear of chaos drove them to do things that seem insane to us today. It drove them to work themselves to death building temples to please the gods, hoping that if they built enough statues, the river would rise again. Let's look at a specific example of a king who pushed his people too far in the name of his own strange beliefs. His name was Akhenaten. You might have heard of his wife, Nefertiti. She is famous for being beautiful, but her husband was different. He decided that all the old gods, Amun, Osiris, Isis, were fake. He said there was only one god, the Aten, the disk of the sun. He banned the old religion. He closed the temples. This put thousands of priests out of work and caused a massive economic crisis. But he went further. He decided to build a brand new capital city in the middle of nowhere. It is a place we call Amarna today. He chose a spot in the desert that was brutal. It was a natural oven. The cliffs reflected the sun's heat onto the city. and he ordered his people to build it fast. Archaeologists have dug up the cemeteries of the common people who lived and died in Amarna. The bones tell a tragic story. They found the skeletons of children and teenagers. These weren't kids who died of disease. These were kids whose bones were deformed from carrying heavy loads. Their spines were crushed. Their knees were damaged. This means that Akhenaten was forcing children to haul heavy stones and bricks in the blistering sun to build his city of light. The malnutrition rate was sky high. The people were working themselves to death for a king who was living in a fantasy world. And when Akhenaten died, the people hated him so much that they abandoned the city. They smashed his statues. They scratched his name off the walls. They tried to erase him from history. That is how much they suffered under his religious revolution. This is the disturbing truth about ancient Egypt that you don't see in the museums. Behind every great change, there was a mountain of human suffering. But let's step away from the kings and look at the psychological toll on the regular person. How did they handle all this death and fear? They developed some very strange coping mechanisms. One of them was letters to the dead. If you were having bad luck, maybe you got sick, or your house fell down, you might suspect that a dead relative was haunting you. Maybe your dead uncle was angry that you didn't bring enough food to his tomb. So, people would write letters on bowls or scraps of papyrus. They would write things like, "Why are you doing this to me? I was good to you when you were alive. I gave you a proper burial. Please stop hurting me." They would take these letters to the tomb and leave them there, hoping the ghost would read them and calm down. Imagine the desperation. You are talking to a bowl, begging a dead person to stop giving you the flu. And then there was the animal cults. This is one of the darkest industries in ancient Egypt. We have found catacombs and underground tunnels filled with millions of mummified animals. Millions. Cats, ibises, a type of bird, baboons, crocodiles, dogs. For a long time, people thought these were beloved pets. Oh, how sweet. They buried their kitty number. That's not what happened. These animals were raised on industrial farms. They were bred specifically to be killed. Pilgrims would come to a temple to pray. The priests would say, "If you want your prayer to be heard by the cat goddess Bastet, you should buy a mummified cat and offer it to her." So, you would pay the priest. The priest would go to the farm, take a young cat, sometimes a kitten, and snap its neck. Then they would quickly dip it in resin, wrap it up, and give it to you to place in the tomb. It was a factory of death. We have x-rayed these mummies. Many of the cats were less than a year old. They had broken necks. It was a massive money-making scheme for the priests, preying on the fears of the people who just wanted a little bit of luck in a hard world. This desperation brings us back to the home. We talked about women and children, but what about the men? What was the pressure on them? The pressure was to succeed, to become a scribe. There is a famous ancient text called the Satire of the Trades. It is basically a father talking to his son, trying to convince him to go to school. The father describes all the other jobs in Egypt and how terrible they are. He says, "Look at the coppersmith. His fingers are like the claws of a crocodile, and he stinks more than fish eggs." He says, "Look at the barber. He shears until late in the evening. He goes from street to street looking for someone to shave. He breaks his arms to fill his belly." He says, "The mason, the builder, his loins are ruined. He is always bent over. He washes himself once, and he is dirty again instantly." He says, "The washerman, he washes the clothes of neighbors. He is close to the crocodiles at the riverbank. He handles the underwear of dirty people." The father is telling the son, life is hard, dirty, and painful unless you learn to read and write. This shows us that the Egyptians themselves knew how brutal their lives were. They didn't romanticize manual labor. They hated it. They wanted to escape it. But for most of them, there was no escape. You did what your father did. If your father was a ditch digger, you were a ditch digger. And speaking of digging, let's talk about the specific dangers of their homes again. We mentioned scorpions, but we didn't mention the fire. Their houses were small. They cooked over open fires inside or in the courtyard. The roofs were made of dry straw and wood. Fire was a constant, deadly threat. If a fire started in a village, it would jump from roof to roof. There were no fire trucks, no hoses, just a line of people with clay pots. A whole village could burn to the ground in minutes. And if you were burned, the medicine was, again, horrific. They might put frog fat or goat dung on the burn. But maybe the saddest part of their lives was the sheer amount of grief they had to carry, because people died so young. Almost everyone was a widow or a widower, or an orphan. It was a society of survivors. You would marry young, maybe at 15. By the time you were 25, you might have lost 2 children and your spouse. You would remarry, and maybe lose that spouse too. Death was the only constant companion. This is why their festivals were so important. You might think, why did they party if life was so bad? They had a festival called the Festival of Drunkenness. It was exactly what it sounds like. Once a year, to honor the goddess Sekhmet, a lion goddess who nearly destroyed the world. The whole goal was to get as drunk as possible. They drank beer until they passed out. They wanted to reach an altered state. They wanted to forget the hardness of the ground, the heat of the sun, and the ache in their backs. They wanted to see the gods. It was a release valve for a society under extreme pressure. Now, I want to take you to a specific place, the Valley of the Kings. We think of it as a majestic place of silence, but when it was active, it was a place of noise, dust, and secrets. The workers who built these tombs lived in a village called Deir el-Medina. We know more about them than almost anyone else because they left behind thousands of notes written on limestone flakes. These notes tell us about their daily struggles. And do you know what the most common complaint was? I am sick, my eyes hurt, I was stung by a scorpion. But they also went on strike. Yes, the first labor strike in recorded history happened in ancient Egypt. It was during the reign of Ramesses III. The government was failing. The food rations didn't arrive. The workers were starving. They put down their tools. They marched to the temple and sat down. They shouted, "We are hungry. We have no clothes. We have no oil. We have no fish." This breaks the illusion of the happy, obedient worker. These people were desperate. They were willing to risk their lives to stand up to the pharaoh because they simply couldn't survive anymore. It shows that the system was often on the verge of collapsing. The glittering gold mask of the king hid a government that was often broke, corrupt, and incompetent. And when the government was broke, the tomb robbing we talked about earlier got even worse. There are court records from trials where the thieves confessed. One thief said, "We opened the coffins. We found the mummy of the king. We found the queen. We stripped the gold which we found on the noble mummy of this god. We set fire to their coffins. They burned the royal coffins just to get the gold metal to melt down." That is how desperate they were. They were burning their own history just to buy bread. So, when you look at a mummy in a museum today, remember that it is a miracle it survived. Most of them were ripped apart by desperate neighbors looking for a quick buck. Let's go back to the river for a moment. There was another danger there that we haven't touched on. The borders. Egypt was rich in grain. The people around Egypt, the Libyans, the Nubians, the Bedouins were often living in even harsher deserts. They looked at the green valley of the Nile with envy. Raids were common. You could be a farmer on the edge of the delta, and suddenly a band of raiders comes out of the sunset. They steal your cattle, burn your house, and maybe take your wife. The pharaoh's army couldn't be everywhere. The borders were porous. The fear of the other, the foreigner coming to take what you had, was a deep-seated anxiety in the Egyptian mind. This is why they drew their enemies on the soles of their sandals so they could trample them with every step. It was a very xenophobic society. They didn't trust outsiders, and given the world they lived in, can you blame them? Now, let's talk about the field of reeds again, their version of heaven. In many religions, heaven is a place of rest. You sit on a cloud, you play a harp, you relax. Not in Egypt. In the Egyptian afterlife, you were expected to work. The field of reeds was just a better version of Egypt. You still had to plow the fields. You still had to harvest the grain. The only difference was that the crops grew taller and the lions didn't eat you. But the fact that they couldn't even imagine a paradise without hard labor tells you everything you need to know. Work was the defining feature of their existence. It was inescapable, even in death. You needed a plow. To get around this, rich people were buried with little statues called shabdas. These were magical servant dolls. The idea was that when the gods called your name in the afterlife and said, "Hey, it's time to dig the irrigation ditch," the little statue would come to life and say, "Here I am, I will do it." If you were rich, you were buried with 365 of these dolls, one for every day of the year. But if you were poor, you didn't have magical dolls. You were going to be digging ditches for eternity. Even in the afterlife, the class system didn't go away. The poor served the rich, forever and ever. So, we have established that manual labor was a nightmare that lasted into eternity. Naturally, every parent in Egypt wanted to save their child from that fate. They wanted their son to be a scribe. We often think of scribes as just guys sitting cross-legged writing on paper. It looks peaceful, but the road to becoming a scribe was paved with beatings. The education system in ancient Egypt had a motto: a boy's ear is on his back, he listens when he is beaten. School wasn't a place of learning and fun. It was a place of strict, physical discipline. If you were a young boy sent to the house of life to learn, you had to memorize hundreds of hieroglyphic signs. These aren't like our 26 letters. These were complicated pictures. If you messed up a drawing, whack. If you lost focus, whack. The teachers believed that pain was the only way to make knowledge stick. So, while these kids weren't out in the hot sun hauling stones, they were trapped in a room, terrified of making a mistake, covered in bruises. It was mental torture instead of physical torture. And what happened if you grew up and got into trouble with the law? We talked about tomb robbers, but what about regular crimes? What if you stole a cow? What if you didn't pay your taxes? The justice system was a broken bar, creative, and not in a good way. There was a place, a city on the edge of the desert, that the Greeks later called Rhinocolora. This translates to the city of cut-off noses. This wasn't a myth. It was a real place. It was a prison colony for criminals. But the Egyptians didn't just lock you up. They wanted to mark you forever. So, before they sent you there, they would cut off your nose. Imagine an entire city filled with people who have no noses. It served two purposes. First, it was a punishment. But second, if you ever tried to escape and go back to a normal village, everyone would know instantly that you were a criminal. You would be a permanent outcast. You could never hide. This is the dark truth about the pyramids and the society that built them. It was a culture of fear. You obeyed because the consequences of disobeying were permanent disfigurement. But sometimes, the law wasn't decided by a judge. Sometimes, it was decided by a statue. This is one of the strangest things about their daily life. They had oracle trials. Let's say you are accused of stealing a neighbor's goat. You say you didn't do it. There is no evidence. So, during a festival, when the priests are carrying the heavy gold statue of the god Ammon on a boat carried on their shoulders, you would run up to the statue. You would ask, "Oh Ammon, is this man guilty?" If the priests who were carrying the heavy statuette stumbled forward, that meant yes. If they stumbled backward, that meant number. Think about that. Your entire life, your reputation, your nose, could depend on whether a group of tired priests stumbled forward or backward. It was a system wide open to corruption. If the priests didn't like you, or if your neighbor paid them off, the god would find you guilty. There was no appeal. The god had spoken. Now, let's get a little visceral. I want you to imagine the smell of an ancient Egyptian city. We see the clean stone temples in the movies. We don't smell the reality. They didn't have a sewage system like we do. They had chamber pots. And in a crowded city like Thebes, waste disposal was a major problem. But it gets worse. One of the biggest industries in Egypt was leather making. They needed leather for sandals, for armor, for shields, for water skins. To make leather soft, you have to tan it. And the best chemical they had for tanning leather was urine, stale urine. So, tanneries would pay people for their urine. They would have big vats of it sitting out in the hot sun. They would soak the animal skins in it. Then, to make the leather even softer, they would rub animal dung into it. Imagine living next door to the tannery district. The stench in the summer heat would have been eye-watering. And the workers? The satire of the trades that I mentioned earlier says the tanner's odor was awful. It says, his hands are red with the dye, and he smells like a corpse. These people lived in filth to create the luxury goods for the rich. And speaking of filth, let's talk about laundry. We take clean clothes for granted, but washing clothes in the Nile was hard, dangerous work. You had to take the linen down to the Riviera where the crocodiles live, remember, and beat the dirt out of it. But to get the stains out, they used natron, a type of salt, and sometimes, you guessed it, more urine. because the ammonia cleans stains. So the laundry workers were standing knee-deep in the river, trampling on clothes soaked in human waste, trying to get them white. It was a gross, unending cycle. Now, let's zoom out and look at the big picture of history again. We often think of Egypt as this powerful empire that conquered everyone. But for long periods of time, Egypt was the one getting bullied. There was a time called the Hyksos period. A group of foreigners came from the north and took over. For over 100 years, the Egyptians were second-class citizens in their own country. The Hyksos had technology the Egyptians had never seen. The horse and the chariot. Imagine the terror of an Egyptian foot soldier who has only ever fought other guys walking on foot. Suddenly, this thundering beast comes charging at you, pulling a platform with a guy shooting arrows. You would have stood no chance. It was like fighting a tank with a stick. The Egyptians were humiliated. They were taxed by these foreigners. It took generations of fighting to finally kick them out. But the worst invasion came much later, from the Persians. And this story really highlights how the Egyptians' own beliefs were used against them. We talked about the animal cults, right? The cats and the dogs? Well, the Persian king, Cambyses II, knew about this. There is a famous legend that might be an exaggeration, but it tells you something about the time that when the Persians attacked the Egyptians at the Battle of Pelusium, they did something psychological. The Persians knew the Egyptians loved cats and believed they were sacred to the goddess Bastet. So, the story goes that the Persian soldiers painted images of cats on their shields. Some versions even say they carried live cats in front of them as they marched. The Egyptian archers pharaohs, they couldn't shoot. If they missed and hit a cat, they would be damned for eternity. They would be executed by their own priests for killing a god. So, the Egyptians hesitated, and the Persians slaughtered them. Imagine losing a war in your entire country because you were too afraid to hurt a cat. It sounds funny, but it was a tragedy. It shows how their deep religious fear paralyzed them. After the Persians took over, they treated the pharaohs with disrespect. They mocked the gods. They killed the sacred Apis bull. It was a time of deep national trauma, and this brings us to a sad reality. Why life was brutal in ancient Egypt wasn't just about physical pain, it was about the fear of being forgotten. The Egyptians believed that you only lived forever if your name was spoken. To speak the name of the dead is to make him live again. But what if you were poor? You couldn't afford a stone tomb with your name carved on it. You were buried in the sand. Within a generation, your children might die. And then, silence. No one remembers your name. To the ancient Egyptian mind, this was total obliteration. It was a second death that was permanent. The anxiety of being forgotten drove them crazy. It's why they covered every inch of wall with writing. They were screaming into the void, I was here, I mattered. But for 99% of them, the silence won. We don't know the names of the people who built the pyramids. We don't know the names of the mothers who died in childbirth. They are just dust. Let's talk about another group that is often forgotten. The elderly. If you survived the childhood diseases, the wars, the childbirth, and the labor, and you actually made it to 50 or 60, what happened then? There was no retirement plan. There was no social security. If you were old and your body was broken from years of farming, you had to rely entirely on your children. This is why they had so many kids. It wasn't just because they loved babies, it was an economic necessity. You needed a son to feed you when you couldn't hold a plow anymore. But what if your children died? We know the child mortality rate was high. If you ended up old and childless, you were in serious trouble. You might have to beg. There are texts where old people describe being cast aside like an old garment. There is a skeleton found in a worker's village of an old woman. She had lost all her teeth. Her bones were brittle, but someone had been chewing her food for her. Someone had been caring for her. It's a touching moment of humanity, but it also shows how helpless she was. Without that person chewing her food, she would have starved to death in days. Dependency was total. And let's look at the emotional toll of the environment again. The isolation. Egypt is a valley. On both sides, there are cliffs. Beyond the cliffs, death. The Egyptians didn't travel much. They weren't like the Greeks who sailed all over the ocean exploring. Most Egyptians were born, lived, and died within a 10-mile radius. They never saw a mountain. They never saw snow. They never saw the ocean. Their world was incredibly small. This created a fishbowl effect. Everyone knew everyone's business. If you did something shameful, the whole village knew. The social pressure to conform, to be normal, to follow Matt, was suffocating. You couldn't just move to the big city and reinvent yourself. You were trapped in your social role. Let's shift to something that sounds like a modern problem but was huge back then. Addiction. We talked about the festival of drunkenness, but alcohol was a daily staple. The water from the river wasn't always safe to drink because of the bacteria. So, everyone drank beer, even kids. The beer back then was thick, almost like a gruel. It was nutritious, but it was also alcoholic. There are writings where scribes warn their students, do not get drunk in the beer halls, do not let people see you falling down. This suggests that alcoholism was a real problem. People were self-medicating. When your back hurts from carrying stones, and your teeth hurt from the sand, and you are terrified of demons, getting drunk sounds like a pretty good escape, but a drunk population is also a messy one. Fights were common. Domestic violence was likely common. We see court records of people suing each other for assault. He hit me with a stick while he was drunk. It wasn't a peaceful, meditative society. It was loud, rowdy, and often violent. And what about the dark side of their magic? We think of magic as spells for healing, but they also had execration texts. These were voodoo dolls, essentially. If you hated the king of Nubia, or if you hated your neighbor, you would write their name on a clay pot or a figurine. Then, you would smash it, you would spit on it, you would bury it. They believed this would physically hurt the person. The government even did this. The pharaoh would have priests write the names of all the enemies of Egypt on pots and smash them in a big ritual. It shows a mindset where they believed they could hurt people from a distance. It was a culture of psychological warfare. Now, I want to talk about a specific medical condition that plagues us today, but was a mystery to them. Cancer. Did they have cancer? Yes, we have found mummies with bone cancer. We have found evidence of tumors. Imagine having a growing tumor in your leg or your stomach. You can feel it. It hurts. You go to the doctor. He doesn't know what it is. He calls it a swelling of the god Khonsu. He might try to cut it out again, with no anesthesia, or he might just put a poultice of dates and salt on it. The confusion and the helplessness of watching a loved one waste away from a disease that no prayer and no medicine could stop must have been agonizing. They didn't have the comfort of knowing why it was happening. They just thought the gods were angry. And let's not forget the simple misery of the heat. We have air conditioning. We can't escape the sun. They couldn't. In the south of Egypt, in the summer, it can reach 120 degrees. The heat is relentless. It zaps your energy. It makes tempers short. The rich had homes with high ceilings and small windows to keep it cool. They had pools. But the poor? They were baking in their mud huts. Heat exhaustion was a daily killer. You had to work through it. The overseer didn't care if it was 110 degrees. The pyramid wasn't going to build itself. So, when you combine the heat, the hard labor, the bad teeth, the parasites, the fear of starvation, and the oppression of the king, you start to see why they were so obsessed with the next life. This life was just too hard. They needed to believe that something better was waiting for them. They needed the field of reeds to be real, because if it wasn't, if this brutal struggle was all there was, that was too terrible to contemplate. There is a famous poem from ancient Egypt called the Song of the Harper. It is unusually cynical. It was found in a tomb, but it doesn't talk about how great the afterlife is. It says, none comes from there, to tell of their state, to tell of their needs, to calm our hearts, until we go where they have gone. It basically says, nobody has ever come back from the dead to tell us if it's real. We are just guessing. This shows that deep down, even they had doubts. Imagine the existential dread. You spend your whole life preparing for the afterlife, spending all your money on a tomb, suffering through the pain. And then a little voice in the back of your head whispers, what if there is nothing? That doubt, buried under all the gold and the rituals, might be the most human and the most painful thing of all. We have almost reached the end of our survey of suffering, but there are still a few more stones to turn over. We haven't talked about the Sea Peoples. This sounds like a mythical name, but they were the terror of the ancient world. Around 1200 BC, the entire Bronze Age world collapsed. Civilizations vanished. Cities were burned. and out of the ocean came these mysterious raiders. Egypt was one of the only nations to survive, but just barely. Pharaoh Ramesses III fought them off. The temple walls show the battles. It was a fight for survival. The sea peoples came with their families, looking for a new home. It was a migration of desperate people colliding with a settled empire. The carnage was massive. The Nile ran red with blood. Egypt survived, but it was never the same again. It was exhausted. The treasury was empty. This led to the strikes and the tomb robbing we talked about earlier. It was the beginning of the long, slow decline. The golden age was over. The lights were flickering out. As we come to the end of our journey, we have to look at what happened when the lights finally went out, because no empire lasts forever. After thousands of years of building, fighting, and surviving, the great engine of Egypt began to slow down. The Nile still flooded, but the government was too weak to manage it. The priests got too powerful, the army got too expensive, and the people got too tired. Foreign power, said the Greeks. And eventually the Romance came in and took over. The ancient gods were slowly replaced by new ones. The hieroglyphs, the writing system that the scribes had been beaten to learn, was forgotten. For over 1,000 years, nobody on earth could read a single word on the temple walls. The silence that the Egyptians feared so much had finally arrived. But here is the amazing thing. Even though the civilization fell, the people didn't disappear. The farmers kept farming. The mothers kept birthing. The struggle continued, just under new masters. When we look back at all of these, the diseases, the whips, the hunger, the fear, it is easy to see it as a horror story. And in many ways, it was. The messed up truth about the pharaohs is that they were often tyrants who treated human beings like disposable tools. They built their dreams on the nightmares of the poor. But if we only see the pain, we miss the most important part of the story. We miss the resilience. Think about the sheer toughness of the average Egyptian. They woke up every day in a world that wanted to kill them. The river wanted to drown them. The sun wanted to burn them. The king wanted to enslave them. And yet, they got up. They planted their seeds. They raised their children. They told jokes. They drank beer. They fell in love. They found moments of beauty in the middle of the brutality. They wrote love poems. We have found them on scraps of pottery. My heart flutters when I see you, like a bird in a trap. Even with the parasites and the heat, they still felt the same butterflies in their stomach that we feel today. They made toys for their children. We have found little wooden horses on wheels. We have found spinning tops. Even though child mortality was high, they didn't stop playing. They didn't stop trying to make their kids smile, even if just for a short time. This is the real miracle of ancient Egypt. It's not the Great Pyramid. A pile of rocks is just a pile of rocks, no matter how big it is. The miracle is the human spirit that refused to be crushed by it. So, the next time you see a documentary or read some crazy facts about ancient Egypt, try to look past the gold. Look at the statues of the regular people. Sometimes you see them in the corners of museums. The statues of the bakers, the brewers, the scribes. Look at their faces. They look tired, but they also look proud. They are the ones who really built civilization, not the kings. The kings just gave the orders. The people, the ones with the bad teeth and the aching backs, they were the ones who lifted the stones. They were the ones who tamed the river. They lived lives that were nasty, brutish, and short, but they lived them with a courage that we should admire. We often complain about our modern lives. The Wi-Fi is slow. The traffic is bad. The coffee is cold. But we are standing on the shoulders of giants who endured things we can't even imagine. We are the lucky ones. We have the painkillers. We have the air conditioning. We have the freedom to choose our own jobs and marry who we love. We have the science to understand why we get sick. But deep down, we are the same as them. We are still scared of death. We still want to be remembered. We still want to protect our families. The clothes have changed, and the technology has changed, but the human heart hasn't changed a bit in 5,000 years. We are still trying to find balance and order in a chaotic world. So, as we leave the Valley of the Kings and let the desert wind cover the tracks of the past, let's give a silent thank you to the millions of forgotten souls who lived and died along the Nile. They suffered so that history could happen. They are the silent ancestors of us all. Their names may be lost, but their labor shaped the world. And by telling their true story and not the fairy tale, but the gritty, painful, real story we are, in a small way, making them live again. We are breaking the silence. Thank you for walking this long, sandy road with me. It's been a heavy journey, I know. We saw some dark things, but sometimes, you have to turn off the lights to see how bright the stars really are. Outro. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the real life of the ancients. I hope this video made you think, and maybe even made you appreciate your modern dentist a little bit more. If you enjoyed this storytelling style and you want to hear more honest, simple, and maybe slightly dark stories from the past, please do me a huge favor. Click that like button. It really helps the video get found by other history lovers. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. My name is Boring History Guy, but I promise to do my best to make sure the history is never actually boring. We have so many more eras to explore, from the muddy trenches of wars to the silent halls of forgotten castles. Leave a comment down below and tell me, would you have survived a day in ancient Egypt, or would you have tapped out as soon as you saw the dentist coming with a copper chisel? I know I wouldn't have lasted an hour. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, and for keeping the past alive. Until next time, stay curious, and sleep well.